Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dean's Forum this second Sunday of Epiphany and on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Good to have you with us. And also a greeting and welcome to those of us who are joining us online. I'm Bishop Dan. I am filling in some respects, in some roles, for Dean Richard while he's away on sabbatical. We have as our guest today Dr. Sheila Davaney. She is the Harvey H. Potthoff Professor Emerita at Iliff School of Theology, where she taught for 27 years and now serves as Vice President for Institutional Advancement.
Interim.
Got it. Interim. Well, as interim to interim. She has also served as the Ford Foundation Program Officer for Religion and Public Life and as visiting senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She's the author of numerous widely respected books. So, welcome, Dr. Davaney, and thank you for helping us out this morning with understanding this deep and complex and important topic. To start, could you tell us just a little about your academic focus and how you came to that?
Good morning. Thank you, Dan. One of the nice things about being asked to do this by Tina is Dan and I have gotten to know each other and have been exchanging resources and having conversation. I'm going to talk about how we as a nation got here today, but how I got here. My academic focus really doesn't have anything to do, or didn't have anything to do with what I'm going to talk about. I was trained as a theologian. Most of my work was in 19th and 20th century thought. I was very textually oriented. I worked both in the European tradition and in the early American tradition, as well as working on things like feminist theology, liberation theology, etc., more contemporary stuff. I became a pragmatist in the American tradition. That tradition is concerned with how ideas work on the ground, what kind of work they do, what kind of lives are made possible, what is hindered. And it drove me more and more to be impatient with the academy, even though that was where all of my life was, and more interested in what was going on more broadly. I will not tell you how I ended up at the Ford Foundation. It was not on my bingo card, but I had a grant from them, and they decided that instead of letting me live my life through that grant, I should come and work there, which I did, thinking I was going to be doing working on an academic program, which is what they had, and a new president said, "Why should we do anything around religion?" They answered that 6 years later by killing the program. But from their perspective, the kind of justice work they were doing, religion seemed to be hampering it. It was the enemy for many people, I have to say, in the foundation. The new president said to me, build a progressive faith movement. And I looked at him and thought, well, there is one, but no one knows anything about that. So in the years I was there, set about trying to build nonprofit groups, faith-based or rooted groups that were working on justice issues that were the bread and butter of the foundation: immigration, sexuality rights, economic inequality, those kinds of things. When I left, I went to the Center for American Progress, which is the think tank of the Democratic Party, basically. And they have a religion program, and I got to pick a project, and I decided to look at the progressive faith movement. Well, before I got to that, I thought I better understand how we had gotten where we were in the narrative about faith in America. We live in a country in which religion has been ingredient in multiple diverse forms from its beginning. Indigenous people had their own cultures and ways of life. People from Europe came to not to the United States, to these shores from multiple religious traditions. From the beginning, there were a variety of Christians here, but also Jews and Catholics. This country has been diverse for a long, long time. Faith has been debated and played a role in public life. There were, in the beginning of the country, as we emerged from our relationship with England, there were those who wanted the United States to have an official religion. They wanted it to be tied to the Church of England. Others, the Baptists of Danbury in Connecticut, wrote Thomas Jefferson and said, "What about us? We need to have a separation of church and state to ensure smaller and minority religions are protected." So we've had these debates. In the Civil War, we had theologies of slavery in the Confederacy. After the war, we had theologies of the lost cause. Abolitionists appealed to faith. Other groups, in every instance, have come on one side or another to make their claims for their political perspectives and their visions for our society out of their religious convictions. We have not had one group, one denomination, one religious orientation that was the only voice in this country or the only voice that could claim Americanness and faithfulness. In recent decades, probably around the last 50 years, we have developed a narrative that is widely spread, and every time I think it's dying, it rears its head again. And that is that America is a religious country, that it is a Christian country, that white Christianity is white conservative Christianity is true Christianity, and that is identified with the Republican Party, not more broadly with other groups. That is a narrative that has been around now for about 50 years. And how did we get to that narrative? Because it wasn't the earlier narrative, though there were versions of it. So very briefly, the 60s and 70s happened most. Tony's here. He knows the sociological changes out of the post-World War II world. All sorts of changes happened. White soldiers came back. Many moved into the middle class, moved to suburbia. Black soldiers came back and said, what about us? We fought to protect this country, and we live in a segregated society. The civil rights movement took off in great strength. The women's movement began to emerge, the second wave of feminism. Women went to college in great numbers. Women went into the workforce. Women began to question their role staying at home. The sexual revolution happened. I'm old enough to remember, the summer of love. Go to San Francisco with flowers in your hair. That took off. The beginnings of the gay liberation movement took off. And increasingly, the drumbeat against the Vietnam War from the late 60s into the 70s increased. That caused enormous shifts in culture, but also enormous disease. We also had political violence, not only against civil rights workers. 1963, John Kennedy is assassinated. 68, we have King, whose birthday is today, and we are celebrating the national holiday tomorrow, is assassinated. Bobby Kennedy, a few months later, is murdered in Los Angeles. One of the big turning points is after Kennedy dies, the next year, 1963, 1964, the election comes. Lyndon Johnson wins overwhelmingly. Barry Goldwater is wiped out. The combination of that loss led some very particular Republican strategists to say, we need a new strategy. We need new partners. We need a different kind of Republican Party that doesn't look and act like the Republican Party we have now. And they set about building an alliance, building the religious right, and building an alliance with the religious right. It was not an accident. It was not organic. It was a major, major shift. Because, in fact, the South had been very democratic and conservative, and it shifted. So how did they do that? I want to list just a few of the, and I'm going to go fast because we've got a lot of stuff to do here. How did that get built? And as I said, it was not an accident. It was a plan. First of all, money. Millions and millions and millions of dollars were poured in to building up the religious right and creating alliances between the secular conservatives and religious conservatives. And much of that money came, yes, from religious groups, but a lot of it came from secular groups who couldn't have cared less about religion, but who saw this as a strategic partnership. Institution building. And I'm going to just run these through because when I talk about what happened to the progressive faith movement, you're going to go, oh, that was missing. Institution building. The recognition that institutions have impact and can move policy forward. Leadership development and spokespersons. People were identified across the country, some of whom were, pastors in churches who never thought of being public figures, who were plucked and trained and given platforms and created a much bigger public presence. Grassroots organizing, in a way that progressive groups or liberal groups just didn't ever get until maybe recently. Grassroots organizing, school boards, state-based organizing, getting on voter boards. It is amazing to me. We're seeing this all over again about some of the controversies on books. Well, I can tell you, back in the early 70s, that was part of the strategy. Don't just think nationally. Think about how you work locally. Think about how you become on the city council, how you can do all sorts of things. Galvanizing issues. Let's pick issues that will make people either angry or excited or, really have something to say. So abortion, which had not been an issue in the evangelical community in particular, the Southern Baptist Leadership Conference had passed resolutions supporting abortion. But instead, that was transformed in maybe the lead issue for conservative religious groups over the last 50 years. But others, immigration, school vouchers, prayer in school. We're still dealing with this. Do you get to kneel on the football field? And is that a question of religious liberty? Religious liberty, not for everyone, but religious liberty as an issue for conservative, especially evangelicals who thought they were being disenfranchised. A media enterprise. Some of the conservative media juggernauts are bigger than most broadcast or cable networks. Huge influx of media that is now global, reaches globally. Think tanks. Not everybody was so glad to be associated with some of the most right forms, the moral majority or whatever, but that they did want to have input in this public sphere. And they were glad to be associated with more acceptable Washington think tanks. Now there's kind of a movement apart on that because of the extremism, but still. Alliances. Alliances. There's a long history in which, let's say, Catholicism was seen as the Antichrist by some of these groups. In this 50 years, the religious right that it comes out of the Protestant denominations and conservative right-wing Catholicism have joined forces on numerous issues, including abortion. People who used to not like each other very much are often now partners. The same for an element of the Jewish community that is exceedingly to the right, and it's normally around issues around Israel. These alliances these are alliances you couldn't have imagined 50 years ago, but are now ingredient to part of that. They also did educational institutions. I would just say Liberty University, one of the biggest universities in the country today, one of the biggest. It came into being out of this whole process where generations of people were to be trained and educated and then move out into society. And finally, I would say a great deal of work was done on creating this narrative, a vision of America, a story of America as a particular kind of religious community in which white Christianity, white conservative Christianity, was the center and the touchstone for being true Americans and keeping with our history. The result was a very, very strong movement that wanted to be part of the public discussion in a way that before this there had been much more of an emphasis on personal faith, on piety, always public presence, but now there was a desire to affect public policy, to be at the center of power, to run for office, to control many of those things, and that was somewhat of a shift. Now, I want to say, I'm going to move on and say something about the progressive faith movement, and then I'm going to move back to this in the present and talk about something that Tony and Sandy talked about last week, the emergence, such a public emergence of white Christian nationalism. But before that, I want to say that between this time, the beginnings of this conservative movement that spread and became a very significant presence in American life, many things have also happened, including a changing demographics and changing voting patterns. As I said, part of the strategy and part of then what grew out of this movement was an identification of the conservative Christian movement and the GOP and the Republican Party. And that is simply played out in voting patterns. I will say this and then I will come back to it at the end. In the last series of presidential elections, white Christians have voted for the Republican presidential candidate. No other religion or racial group has had the majority of their members vote that way. They've voted for the Democrats. Now let me say that again, and I'm going to move way beyond Democrats, Republican, but that has to be a little bit in here. In the last presidential elections, the Republican candidates were voted, the majority of people who voted for the Republican candidates were white Christians. In no other group, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Native American, no other racial group did the majority vote for the Republicans. They voted for Obama, Clinton, Biden. So that's a beginning. Secondly, we are in a very different demographic situation than we were in 50 years ago. In the 50s and even into the 60s, white Christian Americans were the majority of the population. Okay? They were the majority of the population, white Christian Americans. Somewhere in the middle of the Obama administration, that changed, and white Christians lost their dominance, their majority status. White Christians now are about 42% of the population. By the 2040s somewhere, it used to be mid-century, now we're talking about 2045 or something, I'm looking at Tony. Whites are still the majority because they're whites who aren't Christian. So there are whites that are still the majority, but that will not be the case from the mid-2040s on. Maybe that will accelerate. So first of all, white Christian Americans who once were the majority of people in this country are no longer the majority of people in this country. And whites will soon not be the majority of people in this country of any religious background. That has caused, I think, all sorts of anxiety and backlash, etc. We are also now the most religiously diverse country in the world. That doesn't mean that Christians are not still the dominant across the board if you count black Christians, if you count Asian Christians, Hispanic Christians, all that. Still the majority, but we represent in this country more religious communities and traditions than any other place in the world, and that's only increasing. And finally, we are growing rapidly into what are called the unaffiliated or the nuns. In young people, it's into the 30% now of people who do not have any affiliation with a faith group. Now, that's a pretty encompassing term. It means people who may go to church but don't want to become a member. It may be people who who are eclectic and bring together traditions. You know, they're Wiccan and I had a student who was Wiccan and Presbyterian. You know, there are people, and when I say that, she was also a Presbyterian minister she was training to be. So this wasn't superficial. This was some kind of, so we have a lot of that. But it is a changing situation that's very important. So, all right, do you want to ask me something now? Or, and then I do want to say something about the progressive faith movement, and I want to then bring us all back to that. But why don't you go for it now?
I think you covered it. So, what about some question and answer from the group?
Somebody in the back. Way back.
Oh. Okay.
Thank you. I'm interested, you talked about the last or two presidents' elections, but not the one with Hillary and Trump. So what is thought about why Hillary Clinton lost compared to Trump winning in that particular one?
She won the popular vote. She lost the Electoral College, which is the same way that Trump, I mean, you know, that's how Trump won. The swing votes for Biden ended up, and for Obama ended up, some of the swing states swung the Electoral College. So for most of the recent presidential elections, Democrats have won the popular vote. But because of our Electoral College, which gives the same, you know, gives a greater weight historically to some places with smaller populations, that happens. So, and there are many theories about sexism, etc. Yeah.
I'd like to hear your progressive failures, perhaps.
Okay.
Is it because they didn't see the reactionary times? I've read something where they didn't really prescribe to think tanks, maybe until recently. Is it because we're so
Diverse.
we are so diverse?
Yeah. Do you want me to say a little bit about the progressive faith movement? As I said, when this president looked at me, he said things a lot more bluntly to me, and I was like, ugh, this is really not what in my wheelhouse. But I learned a lot, and mostly I spent along those years I was in New York, traveling the country, meeting with faith-rooted groups that were doing justice work on the ground. If you want to know who's at the border with people lying in the streets in El Paso, it's lawyers and faith groups. This is who it is. If you want to know who are working on the issues of homelessness, if you want to know on multiple issues, there are faith groups there. So one of the first things I tried to do, because I was in an environment where there was a clear sense that religion and progressive commitments to justice were in tension. Not among everybody. My African American colleagues did not see this for the most part. The civil rights movement was a faith movement deeply that continues today. I think of Will Barber, who was head of the NAACP in North Carolina, who began Moral Mondays. A preacher, head of the NAACP, now heads a center at Yale. But for my white colleagues, there was a profound sense that there was a tension between justice work and being part of a faith community. So the first thing I had to ask myself was, what's in a name? When we say progressive faith movement, what does that mean? The people I worked with who came out of, especially the black community, they have a long history with progressive who said, that was as bad as liberal, and liberal left us behind often. So they chose the word prophetic faith movement. Others like the word progressive. So I kept that. I called my work or my analysis progressive and justice movement. But when I looked at the progressive movement, it's diversity all the way down. I have to say, it's diversity all the way down. There's an old saying in philosophy and in theology about elephants being on top of each other, and the answer is they're elephants all the way down. Well, for philosophy and theology, it's interpretation all the way down. In the progressive and justice faith movement, it's diversity all the way down. There are people who come from evangelical backgrounds. There are people who come from different political parties. There are people who come from different racial configurations. They have different issues. They don't share theology. They don't share, they're coming together to work on issues and a vision for an inclusive, just America and world. And if you want one kind of set of characteristics, you're going to have a hard time. Secondly, I'll just like I did the characteristics for the other one, I'll give you just a list, and then we can ask about that. The religious right and now Christian white nationalism, or the conservative faith movement more broadly, is heavily seen in the South, Southeast, and the Midwest, but everywhere. In terms of the progressive faith movement, it's more geographically dispersed. There are groups in Texas and in Atlanta, the people who turned out the vote in the special election in Georgia come out of this movement. But it's heavily represented out here in the West. We have the largest unaffiliated groups. We have, the West is a kind of interesting herald of the future. It's multi-faith. It is not a Christian movement. It is got strong participation from Muslims, from Jews, from Buddhists, from the spiritual but not religious group. There's no one theological perspective. That's all I can say. I went in and I'm a theologian. I thought maybe I could find a theological vision here. It comes from all different views. As I said, it's Jim Wallace from Sojourners, who comes out of the evangelical movement, and it comes out of the most liberal forms of theological thought you can imagine. No one theology. It's multi-issued. It's not one issue. It's not just abortion. It is the climate. It is racial justice. It's economic justice. People come from all sorts of different places. It's intersectional in the sense that it recognizes many of these issues are connected to each other. That if you're worried about environmental justice, you're probably worrying about racial justice at the same time, and economic inequality, because poor persons of color are the most affected by pollution, by bad environmental things. Not one person I talked to, and I talked to over 100 when I was working on this, over 100 people, not one person wanted to be identified with a political party. They might have voted Democratic, they might be members of the Democratic Party. They did not want to be the progressive alternative. They didn't want to be the mirror of the religious right or conservatives. They found that dangerous. They wanted to be the critics who pushed harder and I know there's big temptation, and they were also, many of them, really ticked off. Jim Wallace said to me, we gave, I don't know, Indiana, I think it was. I think Indiana went for Obama, something unusual. It was us who went there and turned out the vote, and he hadn't been invited to the White House enough. It's often smaller groups. Dan and I talked about this, and maybe you guys have something to say. There's a real distrust with institutions. A lot of small groups that began from scratch and are trying to survive on small budgets, not sure how to work with denominations who have maybe dwindling resources, but have a lot of assets that could be rethought to be utilized in a justice movement. Again, there are official church bodies that have come along on this, and there are others that have resisted, but there's a kind of hard discussion about how people should relate. Also, there are faith groups within secular organizations. I think of the Human Rights Campaign, the major arm of the gay rights movement, that has a faith group that did enormous work around marriage equality. And finally, I would say my definition is it's a movement committed to a more inclusive, just American and global society, but it is all that diversity. It is more an ecology, less an organization. Nobody's running the show. Nobody's running the show. And one of the challenges, I'll just add, I'm not going to give you all the challenges. There's no money. There's still dispersed leadership. There's still that we're working on a media strategy that people can share, those kind of things. But one of the why, there's not a new narrative yet that has gained broad enough commitment in our society that it can move forward.
On that last note, does it need to be a new narrative, do you think? Because it seems to me that their narrative is new, that the narrative about religion in the United States that we learned in school growing up was this place of diversity and the separation of church and state. But on the other hand, it's hard to think about going back to an old narrative because an old narrative isn't really sexy. it doesn't grab you. Do we need a new narrative, or can we go try to remind people of the old narrative?
Well, I think a little bit of both. It seems to me, I do think that if we don't know our histories, and we, in all their ugliness and all their resources, that we're bound to, we're starting from beginning all the time. And we're not dealing with the problematic parts, but we're also not turning to our assets and our resources. But I also think we're a new nation. And part of the anxiety, before I conclude, I'll say something about white Christian nationalism. It's not new, as I'm sure you heard last week. But we're in a situation where I said demographic change is happening. Things are changing, and whenever that happens, there's cultural and societal anxiety, and there's backlash. And so we need to find a way to do that vision. I have to say, to go back to your question, part of the thing that frustrated me the most was trying to convince people that faith groups and the secular progressives should be more in conversation with each other, should not see each other as the enemy. And that has changed a little, but it often feels like you pull out the faith groups for the photo op. Yeah, I will give one example of that. When Prop 8, the anti-gay marriage proposition, went forward in California, the right, who pushed it and won it, totally made partnership with faith groups. All the advertising had American flags and Christian symbolism in the cross. I'm not kidding. If you could have seen some of these films that were put out, it was a Christian America that was under threat by godless gay people, and we had to stop it. The people who were opposed to it, there were faith groups. The secular groups didn't want to have anything to do with them because they thought that was the problem. It won, and then poor black faith groups got blamed for it. The second time around, there was a come to whomever movement and a much greater. But I saw that all the time. One other example, and we had another question. I kept pressing at CAP that the next coming issue, wasn't there yet, was religious liberty. And that we needed a progressive interpretation of religious liberty that was rooted in our history of protecting non-dominant faith groups. And we needed to be in the forefront of that, or we were going to lose that discussion too. CAP held a meeting. I didn't get invited. It was all lawyers. There were no experts in the history of America and its faith groups and the arguments. None of that. It was all what were the legal cases and how can we prepare for those. So that for me is we do need a new narrative. It needs new voices creating that narrative who weren't here in the beginning. And, but it needs to draw on the resources of traditions.
My psychiatrist and psychologist friends tell me that fear is a primary emotion, like a primary color, and so many other emotions grow out of it. And one of the things that has always struck me about the message from the white Christian nationalists is fear. It's us against them. And you alluded to that in the context of the Prop 8 battle in California. Has there been research done on how the Christian right has deployed fear and what, if anything, the progressive or prophetic justice movement can do to counter that?
Oh, good lead-in. So I'm going to say my very short, before we run out of time, thing on white Christian nationalism. Maybe Tony and Sandy disagree on this, but I actually think this is a continuation, that this was of what happened in the late 60s and early 70s in the beginning of that. I think it's just become increasingly public and extreme, and that it's not totally new. But let me just say, for those of you probably are reading about white Christian nationalism all the time. Marjorie Taylor Greene wears a T-shirt saying, "I'm a proud white Christian nationalist." It's our friend on the Western Slope, Lauren Bobart. It's a white Christian nationalist. How to define it? A movement committed to white Christians dominating and controlling cultural and political and social reality in the United States. That's it. It's an attempt to reassert or to continue white Christian control of power in our country, and to have the values of that perspective control what books are in our schools, what history is taught in our schools, etc. Give you a few quotes. It's a desire for Judeo-Christian nation without the Jews, I would say. The Judeo-Christian nation, but not with the Judeo part of it. There have been, in the narrative, Democrats or progressives who are, or independents, are God-denying demons. That's a quote. We have seen it in, let me just say there have been attempts to embody this in policy-wise, certainly around, books and teaching and all this stuff. But also there has been a call for the Supreme Court to allow all 50 states to establish a state religion. First America Legal has been behind it. Its board is full of former Trump staffers. And so the call is the separation of church and state is really a federal matter. It's not a state matter. So Colorado could name the Episcopal Church as its state church. It's a backlash against cultural and economic change, and it's more and more out there. It is more and more extreme. We see it as most extreme in Charlottesville, Mother Emanuel, the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. We see it in its violent form there, but it is now in the halls of our Congress, in our local school boards, in our state governments, especially in places like Florida. And it is definitely driven. We are losers. It's the old immigrants take our jobs. We are losers of power, and we are the rightful owners of power, and we are white Christians. And other Christians aren't really Christian, okay? Non-white Christians aren't Christians, and liberal Christians aren't Christians, or mainline. I'm going to say one other thing and then open it up. There's a kind of tendency, and myself, I look at this and I say, that's the extreme out there. That doesn't have anything to do with me. Robbie Jones, who runs a research institute, Public Religion Research Institute, that is in the paper all the times now. I was his first big funder. Has written this book, White Too Long. And it takes us through a hard history of white Christianity supporting slavery, both in the South and the North, of all the Christian mainline denominations being implicated in this. Everybody, there wasn't but he also brings it down to today. And I have to say, it's kind of shocking when you hear this. Not only do you know what I said earlier, the group that voted for Trump was, and again, also against Obama, were white Christian Americans. Every other group in America voted for the other candidate. But when they dig deep, it's not just that. It's not just that mainstream Protestants voted that way, or white Catholics, white mainstream Protestants, white Catholics voted that way. It is the fact that when you dig deep, the racial bias of white Americans is high on the racism scale. You ask everybody, the people who feel, in surveys, who feel warmest about black Americans are evangelicals. They'll say, yes, 78% we have warm feelings. That's one of the questions. Then, and everybody does. White Catholics, white Protestant, everybody does. Then you ask specific questions. Should people be able to kneel to protest police violence? Overwhelmingly, white Christians are no, 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 no. Overwhelmingly, way beyond how they voted. There is economic disparity tied to issues around race? No, 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 for white Christians. Is there a problem in our criminal system? No, 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 for white Christians. Across the board, way beyond whether you voted Democratic or Republican. When you start asking other people, it's a very different answer. And when you ask the unaffiliated, in some of those questions, there's 30 to 40% difference between what white Christians are answering and what unaffiliated are answering. White Christianity across the board, not just in its extreme forms, has a racial issue, has a racism issue. And that is kind of shocking, I think, for those of us who, and I'm looking at myself, who point it to, I'm not Marjorie Taylor Greene. But there's a lot of work to be done. And it's an organized movement that is extreme based on fear. But guess what? Apparently, many, many of us have fear that we're not quite dealing with. So I'll end there.
Well, I think that the good news is that Christianity is changing.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who consider themselves followers of Christ, but they're also yogis or Buddhists. And so the change is going to come from our hearts. It's going to come from each one of us, not from movements, I don't think. I mean, that's all happening, but it has to start here. So that's the good news to me.
I think, and one of the things I will say is that Robbie ends the book with stories of hope. But they're also stories, they're not so much stories of individual transformation. He's interested in institutions and how within our institutions we can grapple with some of these things. But that's where he ends. There are a lot of people in my own, Tony and my institution, Isle School of Theology, is grappling with the history around Native Americans. You probably read about it. We had a book 150 years ago covered with human Indian skin. And that we're doing reparations now 150 years later. But those histories linger. Those histories, for good or bad, linger.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your litany early in the discussion. I think I counted 13 elements of building this, the alliances and the construction of the religious right movement. But I didn't hear you mention the systematic destruction simultaneously of the labor, organized labor, and the relationship between labor and the natural alliance that had been built up with the Democratic Party. So I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I think that's a great question. You know, I want to throw in the progressive faith movement on that. In the 20s and 30s, when the labor movement was being built, some of the greatest allies in that building were faith groups. the Catholic Church, now probably because there were lots of, my background is Irish Catholic, there were lots of Irish Catholics in the labor movement, but was the strongest supporters of the labor movement. I would say there went through a period, and the Democratic Party eventually, so that union there, went through a period where Democrats became less friendly to labor movements, though labor movements there was a cutoff for some of those who voted Republican. Faith groups disappeared. I will tell you the Catholic Church has disappeared, not totally, but from that long historical support. There was a group called Interfaith Worker Justice, which was the faith arm of the labor movement, deeply appreciated by the unions, present at the table. They changed leadership. Kim Bobo, who founded it, moved on thinking she was doing a great deal. They could not sustain their work, could not get enough support from foundations, from faith groups to continue and close their doors. Now union approval is back at its height, or moving forward again. I wish there was much more faith connected to that formally, and I hope that the Democratic Party does not turn its back on it. That's all I can say. I'm not convinced that won't happen.
You've kind of summarized the environment of my entire adult life here today. And I've often heard it said that the First World War was about the rest of the world acting out because they didn't like the former feudal system. And the Second World War was because they didn't like how they hadn't finished the First World War. What would you say, is there a corresponding sort of headline type summary, which for all its imperfection helps me think about it, of 1950 to now? Is it the emergence of racism right on the surface where we actually talk about it? Or is it a combination, or what would you venture? And it's fair to say no.
Well, I certainly think too, this is the soundtrack of my life. I certainly do think the kind of massive cultural shifts that I just swam in, that they were my life, I came of age as feminism was coming forward. The sexual revolution. I talked to even my friends who were 6 or 10 years older. They were married in their 20s. Hell, I was single and living my life in Cambridge. It was a much more exciting life than they were living, let me tell you. So, and the fear then of people feeling losing ground. I want to tell you one more book that was shocking to me, that I started reading because I saw this professor on the several cable talk shows. Kathleen Belew. She was at Chicago for a while, and now she's at Northwestern, I think. This book is about, so the religious right is emerging in public. The moral majority, the Jerry Falwells, those kind, Pat Robertsons. Going along at the same time is the militia movement that we've kind of, and now that's emerged now. These things are merging together. She ties this to the Vietnam War. And she says every war, she has a line in it. My late husband worked on war and families, the lingering effect on families of war. She says, war always comes home. That line just has stuck with me. War always comes home. Many of the militia people, we were talking about Idaho and how that happened at a certain point, Waco, Ruby Ridge, all these things. Many of the leaders in that, and leaders of a kind of renewed Ku Klux Klan, came out of the military out of Vietnam who felt the government had betrayed them, who felt they had been forgotten. And I think, and then they saw refugees coming. Then they saw other, I think this kind of movement where people are claiming a part of our world, part of our society. Feminism, raises questions, but it's also a movement to embrace possibility. While people saw that where they might have had possibility, now they were the forgotten ones. And that combination of fear, of resentment, a politics of resentment, after the Civil War, it was called the lost cause, and how you maintained Southern values and vision in the face of the loss of the Civil War. I think we have a narrative of loss and deficit and fear that has gripped this nation, and we haven't had a narrative that we've shared enough that there's enough for more than just white Christian males, that there's more, and we could all be better off. And so I think it's not one thing. I think it's those two things growing at the same time.
Well, folks, we need to wrap up in order to get to the celebration of the Eucharist. But I want to thank Dr. Davaney for reminding us of facts that we knew but may not still be on the forefront of our awareness, for introducing a wealth of new facts that I, at least, was not aware of, and for a very astute analysis of it all. So thank you so much, and I invite you to express your appreciation.
Well, thank you for having me. I told Tina your list of speakers look like a DU Iliff in exile.